This screencast is intended for teachers of 4th grade social studies to aid in the teaching of the Georgia Standards of Excellence. The impetus for the abolitionist and suffrage movements in the United States stem from the same base, that all people are created equal and as such deserve the same rights. And so these two movements and the people who contributed to them are inextricably tied to each other. Susan B. Anthony, Frederick Douglass, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Sojourner Truth, and Harriet Tubman were all considered to be reformers, people who sought to literally reform the morals of our society that allowed for the denial of rights for both African Americans or blacks and women. In this screencast, we will look at both the contributions they made and the challenges they had to overcome. Despite Thomas Jefferson's assertion in the Declaration of Independence that all men are created equal, assuming he meant men to mean the universal men or humans, in the years before the Civil War, more than half the adult population in this country was a far cry from equal. Slavery was still practiced throughout much of our nation, but even free African Americans or blacks did not have the right to vote, nor did women regardless of race. In fact, it was only in 1850 that the requirement to own property in order to vote was dropped from all states. Many saw the hypocrisy in this, and so we saw the rise of two movements in our nation aimed at addressing the lack of equality among us. And since it would be hypocritical to fight for the rights of one group of the populace, but not the other, many of the leaders of the abolitionist movement went on to become prominent figures in the suffrage movement. Well, that and the fact that most of them were women probably factored in as well. Moving chronologically, however, we will look at the abolitionist movement first. Let's begin with a definition of an abolitionist, because this may not seem as simple as you might think. In hindsight, it is easy to make the question of whether someone was an abolitionist or not clear-cut, but at the time it was anything but. Some believed in immediate emancipation of all slaves, while others advocated a gradual release. Some believed no slavery was acceptable, while others, despite finding slavery abhorrent, were still willing to overlook it in states that already had it, but felt the new territories or states should be free. So while it is beneficial for our students to come to understand that these distinctions existed, a thorough look at each is not warranted for this age group. For our standard, an abolitionist is someone who believed that the practice of slavery should be abolished, that no level of slavery was acceptable. Now it might seem that the idea of abolishing slavery from our country sprang up suddenly in the mid-1800s, but it had been a bone of contention in our country since its inception. In fact, it was at the heart of the Three-Fifths Compromise during the writing of our Constitution. Sadly, though, while many of these early abolitionists believed slavery was wrong, they didn't really view African Americans or blacks as equal either, and more often than not, it seemed easier just to ignore the problem rather than make waves. That all started to change, however, and the abolitionist movement began to pick up momentum in the 1820s in New England, which ironically was the same region in which the first American slave ship was built. Abolitionists began to unite and form anti-slavery societies, and their first task was to make slavery so unpalatable that it was no longer easier just to ignore it. To that end, they discovered the pen was mightier than the sword, and took to publishing literature that recounted stories brought north by slaves escaping on the Underground Railroad of the horrors of slavery. One such escaped slave was Frederick Douglass, who upon finding his way to freedom immediately took to authoring his own personal and powerful slave narrative, titled Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave, which became a bestseller. He also founded the abolitionist newspaper, the North Star. His eloquent way with words made him a popular orator as well, and served to disprove the belief that many whites held, including many abolitionists, that an African American or black was simply not as intelligent as a white. Even more compelling was the fact that he virtually taught himself to read and write, as it was illegal to teach a slave to read. Frederick Douglass was also a strong supporter of women's rights and the suffrage movement, and lent his considerable voice to that cause as well. Another author who greatly contributed to the changing perceptions about the acceptability of slavery was Harriet Beecher Stowe, with her best-selling novel, Uncle Tom's Cabin. Unlike most anti-slavery publications of the time, which were generally very academic in tone, Uncle Tom's Cabin was a narrative that followed the life and tribulations of its main character, Uncle Tom, and his family who are slaves. These characters worked their way into the hearts of readers and made it impossible to ignore their fate or disregard them as human beings. Supporters of slavery tried to argue that Stowe's was a work of fiction, and that, as a preacher's daughter from Connecticut, she had no real knowledge of what slavery was actually like. But Stowe's story was based on factual recountings from escaped slaves. Later she published The Key to Uncle Tom's Cabin, which was essentially her documentation of her research for the story. With the publishing of Uncle Tom's Cabin and the huge audience it reached, the ranks of the abolitionist movement swelled and began to include some very powerful and influential voices, no doubt greatly influencing the presidential election in which an outspoken opponent of slavery by the name of Abraham Lincoln surprised nearly everyone by winning the Republican Party's nomination for president. It was his eventual election to that office that caused the first Southern states to secede from the Union, leading to the Civil War. Another prominent and popular orator of this time was Sojourner Truth, an escaped slave from New York. Despite being illiterate, having no formal education, Truth was a powerful and moving speaker. She too wrote her personal slave narrative through her friend, Olive Gilbert, titled The Narrative of Sojourner Truth, a Northern Slave. Whereas Frederick Douglass persuaded many with his eloquence, Truth persuaded with blunt honesty. In fact, she once admonished Douglass during one of his appearances on his lack of fire. She garnered much respect with her passion for her causes and her tell-it-like-it-is personality. She spent her entire life traveling the northern half of the country, going wherever there was a need. She worked tirelessly relocating escaped slaves and petitioning the government to provide them with land to work on in the West and an education. If Douglass epitomized the brains of the abolitionist body, then Sojourner Truth would be its life-blood. Sojourner Truth was equally involved in the women's suffrage movement, and it was at the Women's Rights Convention in Akron, Ohio, in 1851, where she delivered her "Ain't I a Woman?" speech, for which she would become most famous for. The short but powerful impromptu speech was predominantly a rebuke of the men at this convention, who had been arguing that women were not strong enough or intelligent enough to vote, and moved the audience to deafening applause. As the words of the abolitionist movement began to turn towards actions, we see the rise of the Underground Railroad. The Underground Railroad was not a railroad at all, but rather the name given to a series of routes that were called lines, and shelters called stations, and people referred to as conductors that would assist fugitive slaves in escaping to the north. The term underground obviously refers to the necessarily secret nature of the operation, as assisting slaves in escaping was highly illegal. One famous conductor on this railroad was Harriet Tubman. An escaped slave herself, Tubman risked capture and a return to slavery each of the reported 19 times she snuck back into the South to assist another group. It is estimated that Tubman personally helped somewhere in the vicinity of 300 slaves escape. So effective was Tubman that at one point there was a bounty of $40,000 on her head, a considerable sum for this time in history. Tubman was one of the more militant abolitionists and helped John Brown plan his ill-fated raid on Harper's Ferry. It was only due to illness that she was not with the raiding party when they took over the armory. She continued to risk her life and freedom working as a scout and spy behind enemy lines during the Civil War, and to assist former slaves in finding new lives once freedom came to all. In contrast to Tubman, Elizabeth Cady Stanton was well educated and raised in relative privilege in New York. As women were discouraged from higher education or pursuing careers, she had a great deal of spare time, and spent much of it at her abolitionist cousin's house, where she wholeheartedly embraced the cause. It was here where she met her future husband and fellow abolitionist, Henry Stanton. For their honeymoon, the Stantons traveled to the World Anti-Slavery Convention in London. It was at this convention that the seeds of the women's suffrage movement were sown, when Stanton, along with all the other women, were banned from the convention floor and were not permitted to participate in the debates. It was here as well that Stanton met Lucretia Mott, with whom she later organized the Seneca Falls Women's Rights Convention. Stanton, along with her friend Susan B. Anthony, formed the National Women's Loyal League, whose purpose was to effect the emancipation of all slaves by way of an amendment to the Constitution that would make slavery illegal throughout the United States. As the daughter of Massachusetts Quakers with strong religious and moral objections to slavery, It is no surprise that Susan B. Anthony became involved in the moral reform movement, and by extension the abolitionist movement, through which she met Stanton. Like many other abolitionist women, it was the many challenges she faced as a woman fighting for this cause, including being barred from speaking at the many abolitionist conventions, that made her turn her attentions to the suffrage movement as well. It was, in fact, Stanton's and Anthony's attempt to link women's suffrage, which is the term used for the fight for women to get the right to vote, to the abolitionist movement that created a deep divide among many reformers. The beginnings of the women's suffrage movement, of which all of the abolitionist figures we have presented thus far were a part of, can be traced back to the Seneca Falls Convention in Seneca Falls, New York, hosted by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and her friend Lucretia Mott. 12 resolutions for the equal rights of women came out of the convention, but surprisingly the only one that generated fierce debate, and was ridiculed by many, was the right for women to vote. Abolitionist Frederick Douglass, one of the only 40 men to attend the convention, spoke out firmly of his belief that women of this nation must have a say in its governance. While all of the historical figures this standard asks us to examine stood up for both the abolition of slavery and the right for women to vote, 55 years would pass between the passage of the 13th Amendment to the Constitution in 1865 that freed the slaves until the 19th Amendment in 1920 that gave women the right to vote. That's all we have time for today. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time. Here are some links to some helpful resources, as well as the works used in the creation of this screencast.